Thank you for coming, and thank you very much for inviting me. You've noticed in the program that I'm the only non-Italian so far. But I think that Leonardo, of course, had a lot to do with France later in his life, and of course, I think yesterday opened a major exhibition at the Louvre. I think it was yesterday. If not the best exhibition. No, I shouldn't say that. Right, so my talk is entitled "The Culture Die Between Renaissance Perspective and the Anthropocene." I mean, obviously, it's a series of speculation and provocation, and what I mean by the culture died, I mean the way we look and represent the world is very much a function of our culture, something that we forget, and vice versa. So the culture very much influences how we see the world. And I'll also mention some of my work towards the end, so that you perhaps understand why I became attracted by this topic and the title. And by culture, I go back to a very old definition by Edward Tyler, 1871. Culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, law, morals, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by men as a member of society. And of course, having heard Federico this morning, we should include language. I mean, yeah. How can we forget about language? Language of the world have a huge influence of how we think about the world. And I'm going to do this in part through my own reading of perspective, which will allow me, of course, to bring in Leonardo. Now, of course, pre-perspective, the world was actually it was not such a bad world. If we look at les très riches heures du Duc de Berry, beautiful series of drawings of the Book of Hours, and but you can see very much a two-dimensional world. Although there's, it's at the time where it's 1412, so at the very beginning of thinking of having maybe depth, but the laws of perspective have not yet been established at the time. And of course, this morning we also heard from Alessandro about, for example, the triumph of death painting, Buffalmacco, which was very much two-dimensional representation of the world, which was in the mid-14th century. And it was very much the Dark Ages. And you can see we start to emerge a little bit from the Dark Ages. And of course, in the history of perspective, at the very beginning, there's Brunelleschi with the one-point linear perspective. I mean, this is not about perspective per se, so I'm not going to go through that. Brunelleschi, of course, became, and also was mentioned this morning, he was an architect, Dome of Florence, etc. And then the famous book by Alberti, De Pictura, I think Brunelleschi was 14, 15, and then De Pictura is, and the first volume is 1435, and I think it is dedicated to Brunelleschi. And Alberti is clearly sort of paying his debt to Brunelleschi. Leonardo arrives, he's a bit younger, arrives a bit later, but he's very, very excited by the perspective. And he says, the most praiseworthy form of painting is the one that most resembles but imitates. I think that's a crucial quote, because you will see later on that this idea of mimetic and imitating is very important, certainly important to my argument. So, of course, the Annunciation, famous painting for its sort of the very rigorous use of the perspective, and The Last Supper, which is slightly later, 1495. And he's terribly, I mean, you probably all have seen how all the lines converge sort of on the head of Jesus Christ. And but slightly more interesting for me is this painting, which is the Adoration of the Magi. We've seen already, sort of 1481, because of the sort of slight fuzziness to it, which we see in the build-up, which we have already seen a couple of times today. I think it's an image which leaves plenty of space for the imagination, and we can see, even picking from what Federico was saying, Wittgenstein talks about images are not pictures. While I'm looking at an object, I cannot imagine it. An image is not a picture, but a picture can correspond to it. So in image, there is the imagination which forms into the mind, and we can try to represent what we have in mind on a piece of paper. But it's not easy to always try to represent what we have in our mind as an image to a picture. So often the picture is a poor representation of our imagination. The image and the word image is very interesting in the link to imagination. You can see, for example, compared to this image, which I think is particularly interesting because it affords many different interpretations. It's very different from what Piero della Francesca does, which is Piero della Francesca. Remember, he's a mathematician, and I think it's very, very precise. It's use of perspective, and the lines, everything is absolutely. And in a way, this is what I mean, is that when I see this picture, I can't imagine another one. While when I see this one, I can have different interpretation, which I think is quite important. So Leonardo, I think you have to place yourself at the point of the Renaissance period, what the extraordinary breakthrough the perspective must have been. And Leonardo is known to have said that perspective was the rein and rudder, in other words, the skeleton of painting. And of course, Panofsky, who has written a lot on perspective, says that all we can do is try to imagine what this achievement meant then. We have to place ourselves then to realize what it would have been like. I mean, it's very much like perhaps the moment of Cubism, or even more, coming from the dark ages of the 14th century. So perspective, suggests Panofsky, not only did it elevate art to a science, but the result was a translation of psychophysiological space into mathematical space, into, in other words, an objectification of the subjective. I think that's an important remark from Panofsky. But also, Panofsky suggests that in this study of the symbolic form, knowledge is about the facts of culture. And he was very interested in the way what perspective gives us. Perspective is like a cultural construct. And perspective doesn't describe a world which already exists, but perspective actually constructs a world for the viewer, which is a cultural world. Now, our friend Jacques Lacan, the 20th century, obviously, remarks that the space pretending to be an image is only possible after the invention of perspective in painting, which architecture adopts in order to represent itself. It's a very interesting way of thinking about that. And some scholars, of course, have suggested that our modern conception of architectural space comes from Alberti's frame of orthogonal telescopic vision. That perspective, in a way, that's the idea of the culture also, changed the way we look at space and architecture. Although the space could have been the same space, we started to look at it differently. I think this is what Alexandra was perhaps suggesting as well, if I understood correctly. And I think that we see that in the, for example, in the axial perspective of the rotunda, the Palladian, most of the Palladian villa, we can perhaps infer that those villas would not have existed without the invention of perspective. So we start to look at the world as a set of potential perspectives, including cities, although we still live for a very long time, including still now, in Cambridge and other cities, in a medieval city. But we have to bear that in mind. So Alberti, of course, has this wonderful expression that talks about the Prince of Rays. So we sort of have the vision which focus onto the eye, on the individual, commands everything on its path. It travels from the observer's eyes parallel to the ground. And this is a famous painting by Dürer, slightly later of 1525. So we have this sort of, obviously this is a perspective machine, but we see very much the oculocentric vision of the world perspective. Of course, and this is the contrast I want to make, is that not all cultures have seen in perspective. And I want to transport you now. We're going to travel to China. And in China, of course, is a completely different tradition, which is called the anti-perspective tradition, which is a wonderful book by Scolari called Oblique Perspective, Chinese method of oblique drawing. And you see, there's a number of elements that we can see here, which is very different from what we're used to in terms of perspective. Of course, there is no, the lines do not join centrally, and the vanishing point is vanished, so to speak. The characters at the back have the same size as the character at the front. There's a sort of parity of people. Another striking feature compared to what you would see in any painting of the Renaissance period, what is it you notice? Jesus, something which is totally missing that we would expect to see. There's no shadows. There are no shadows in those traditional Chinese paintings. There's a huge, huge difference. So we can see that Chinese representation was not a transcription, a direct observation of the real, but of what the inner eye was capable of grasping. In the inner eye is in fact the cultured eye. So, and I think is well known in China. There was a book, still can find it on Amazon, probably, called The Mustard Seed Garden Manual of Painting, which was codifying very, very precisely how to draw and paint in particular nature. You had to have a certain number of trees, rivers had to have sort of a start and an end, etc. So it was very, very, very codified. I would say is the equivalent of Alberti's De Pictura, but slightly later. Now, in their wisdom, the Jesuits from Rome were sent to China, and they had a Jesuit mission for probably 2 to 2.5 centuries. And I think, of course, the idea was to convert the Chinese to the Catholic faith. And the way they were planning to do it, which they thought was very important, and we can see here the extraordinary importance of images, which is that they were doing it with images like this one, the visitation of Santa River by Geronimo. Very important image. And then they arrived and they went to see the emperor, and the emperor was horrified. And he was horrified because, of course, there was a use of perspective, and it resembled too much of our vision, and it wasn't the cultured eyes that had been cultivated for centuries in China. And it became such a failure for the poor Jesuit mission that in order to still try to convert people through images, that they started themselves to draw like the Chinese oblique perspective. So they removed all the shadows, they forgot about the vanishing point. So we have a very different sort of interpretation. So we can see that images have a profound effect on the culture. So images are really, I'll keep mentioning that, but I think images are not innocent. So the attempt to institute a single viewpoint contradicted the very roots of Chinese thought, in which man is not the measure of all things. That's a fundamental difference. According to the Taoist conception, it is nature that expresses itself through the artist. And if it was accepted that perspectival representation was closer in appearance to vision, as early as the 9th century, Suche had written, "He who judges painting according to the concept of resemblance shows the understanding of a child." So if we rewind back and remember what Leonardo was saying, that the strength of the perspective is to imitate, in a way, nature. This was fundamentally different to, of course, what was felt in China. Certainly by the literati, by the intellectual, by people who could sort of understand, because we bring to a picture, of course, what we have, our knowledge, our culture, etc., was sort of the tap-down effect of the picture. If we don't know how to read a painting, then we only see it as a series of signs, what Barthes would call the punctum, as opposed to the studium. So Taoist tradition is completely at odds with the anthropocentric sense of the Renaissance perspective, which put everything at the man is at the center of the perspective. So much so that I have argued that the introduction in China of the perspective was a form of cultural and religious colonization. I may be a bit pushing, but that's what I feel. Now, I have been, since 2010, I've been working with Philippe Descola. He's a French anthropologist. Some of you may have heard of Philippe Descola. He's not that well known in this country, I have to say.
He was here.
He was here, and he'll be here next year as well. He'll be a Slade professor in our faculty. And by chance, I was in the Musée des Quai Branly in Paris in 2010, looking at the new Musée by Jean Nouvel, and I noticed there was this exhibition of Fabrique des Images. And what Philippe Descola proposes is a very different interpretation of iconic images of the world. So he constructs what he calls an ontology, which is that a system of qualities detected in objects, and he divides the world, the images of the world, in 4 different ontologies, corresponding to 4 different cultures. This is the animated world, which is essentially Africa, devoted to animism. Then we have our world, you recognize that, which is an objective world of naturalism, mimetic, etc. And then a subdivided world of totemism, and then the final one, which is the world of analogism, which is, it looks like it's Africa. This is Africa. the analytism covers different parts of the world, and that's the attraction for me of Descolat's theory here, is that it's not just geographically tied, but it's actually going across different parts of the world. So, for example, Japan and China would be part of analogism, so would part of South America. Of course, Descola has done all his field work in South America. And I became particularly interested in analogism because of China and Japan, and it represents the discontinuity among both the body and the interiority of the relationship. And Descola, I quote, says, terms which are joined but must be initially distinguished. So he has, in his exhibition, he has a very interesting section which makes it easier to understand what he calls, we call in French, les faux amis. And two images of landscape. So if we go quickly, we think, oh, they're just landscape. But they're landscape from very different tradition. This is a Chinese landscape, this is a European, French landscape, or chasse aux cerfs. And we can see that the Chinese painting is about the resonance between the cosmos and the painter. And by painting the mountain and the water, the artist is figuring the place of the human body in the world without having actually to represent a human figure, which is really in sharp contrast with the European naturalistic painting. And this is me in 2010 visiting and exploring this very interesting perspective here where Descola was explaining the role of perspective. When we launched a research project I started 2 years ago, he came to us and has followed our project. And I'll explain at the end what our project was, but it's been very useful to work with him. It's a very approachable person. Now he's just retired. So one of in La Fabrique des Images, he talking again about the très riche œuvre de Jules de Berry. He makes the point that of course in Europe, in the 12th century, 14th century as well, we were part of the analogistic world. And he makes the point that a central feature of analogist thinking is a correspondence between the macrocosm, the universe, and the microcosm. The human person sees as a whole world in miniature, so the zodiac body, which we have here in the So at some point, and I think there's still plenty of reminiscence in our culture of this dualism between naturalism and analogism. So he makes, for example, the remark that, say, a cat sitting on the lap of a biologist, and the biologist is part of that scientific naturalist work, but he speaks to the cat, and that's animism. And then he may be consulting his horoscope, in which case that would be part of a world of analogistic world. So I think that it's not so completely easy to decipher. So has this world that the Chinese and the Japanese had imagined disappeared, this world in two dimensions, this world in oblique drawings? No, not quite. And in fact, there's one of the most important digital artists probably in the world are based in Tokyo. They're called Team Lab. Team Lab are particularly interesting because they are actually saying that they are going back to the Heian period of Japan, which is the 9th and 10th century, when there was no perspective. So they are thinking that this is really the true Japanese way of looking at the world. They're just reclaiming that. So there are very much pockets of resistance to perspective still now, in a curious way. Their work has been shown all over the world. There was a huge show recently in Paris by à la Villette. There was in Helsinki. They have a permanent museum in Singapore. We've been to Canada, New York, Los Angeles, and this was the Penz Gallery in London in 2017. I took those pictures, and the show opened on a Monday. By 2 o'clock, all the tickets had gone. So it was it's so incredibly popular. And while the world they imagine is entirely two-dimensional, they immerse you in this two-dimensional world, which they call ultra-subjective space. That's Shanghai. I was in Shanghai in the spring, and they just opened a permanent exhibition in Shanghai. Again, hugely popular. Last year, I visited their office in Tokyo. They have a whole building, 500 people. I think the average age must be sort of 22. And the founder is a very interesting guy called Inoko. I was lucky enough to meet with his colleague in April last year. But simply to say that we have a tendency to think that technology is moving in such a way that we're thinking of virtual world, we're thinking sort of moving in 3 dimensions, etc. I mean, it's a very beautiful project by colleague Frederick Baker. You're reconstructing the dining room of the Stockley House in Brussels. In a way, what they're doing is what TeamLab is doing is completely going the other way, but still using incredibly powerful and well thought out technologies. They have, out of 500 people, they probably have 150 computer programmers, etc. So it's not like if they're not using technologies, but they are thinking about it in a very different way. So this is what their manifesto. The idea of ultra-subjective space has evolved from the concept of spatial awareness of the ancient Japanese, providing immense possibility for digital art. This concept of Japanese spatial awareness is able to blossom once more by expanding the method and notion of beauty by the use of digital technology. They have, at some point, they published a very interesting dialogue they had with a historian of art called Professor Yamashita, and it's Inoko, the founder of TeamLab, who is talking to Yamashita, and they take Leonardo's, interestingly, they take Leonardo's Mona Lisa as an example of what is wrong with the Western perspective, funnily enough. And Inoko, so I just quote a sentence or two, he said, as you know, the background of Mona Lisa is drawn based on Western perspective. From the viewer's vantage point of view, the space recedes into the background. If we were to assume the position of the seated Mona Lisa, we would be looking at the viewer. In other words, it is impossible to assume the vantage point of the subject while simultaneously perceiving the space within the painting. And then Yamashita responds that, yes, it's very different, completely different dimension approach to depicting the natural world, and I believe the Japanese artwork has operated at the very highest level expression of that idea. There's a slight nationalistic view when they express that, but that's quite interesting. Inoko also take this example, which is the tale of the Genji scroll of the 12th century, and he explains their idea of space. He said, for example, in this scroll, which is quite long, so in basic terms, the brain synthesizes the surrounding around the focal point, the floor included, and sees them all at a glance. If hypothetically speaking, we take this as a given, this means that the space inhabited by the subject in the painting and the space seen by the viewer are more or less the same. This means that whether we assume the position of a viewer or a character in the artwork, we can observe the same contents of the image. concluding Japanese art was always about a participatory approach, which is very different, of course, than the single perspective from one person point of view. And they take another example as an example of perhaps of this idea of the Prostitutive Gardens, and they talk about the Jardin de Versailles, which are also, of course, Versailles would not exist without the advent of perspective. It's very much sort of based on this idea. And of course, we all know this famous image as well of the gardens in Alain Resnais last year in Marienbad, where famously, as you can probably notice, they have painted the shadow. There's no shadows for nature, for the trees. It's a bit like, I don't know if he was trying to say something about Japanese or Chinese way of not having shadows. That's another scroll. The first really interesting exhibition about all those ideas of two-dimensionality took place in Paris. I mean, thinking of the West, usually les arts décoratifs in December 1978 was a very important exhibition, and where they were talking about the Western concept of three-dimensional when time is added becomes four-dimensional, whereas in Japan this is strictly two-dimensional, combination of two-dimensional facets. So depth of space is expressed by combining plural two-dimensional assets, which means that through them exists a number of continuous time scales. Now, if we look at moving away from painting and the sort of concept that Inoko was talking about, of course, this has been translated, of course, in real space by Japanese architects. So this is Kengo Kuma, who is a famous Japanese architect, operating now, has built all over the world. So the Japanese space is built through overlapping several bidimensional planes. Whilst in Western architecture, space is limited by thick, heavy wall. Japanese architecture is a space for people is obtained using such a mobile field and light partition formed by wood and paper. And he shows here that in fact this element, this building of space through a series of layers applies both for the landscape, the Japanese landscape, the man-made landscape, and the space as a whole. And I think in his own architecture, he also, there's a very interesting way of looking at nature by sort of building a series of layers and seeing, for example, in this museum, the wood of the museum itself almost sort of being absorbed and disappearing in the hill behind. In overall, of course, the world over, I was mentioning pockets of resistance here, but essentially what has happened is that perspective is everywhere. Perspective has won. And one of the reasons it has won the world over is perspective is built in photography. In the camera apparatus, it is built in the cameras because of the camera obscura, and this is allegedly one of the drawings from Leonardo. Apparently, he has drawn something like 270 drawings of the camera obscura. I haven't seen them all. So we are in a world where we've had this camera eye, and I think there's perhaps better. Can't find a better example than Vertov when he explains the kino eye, the eye of the camera onto the world. Just an extractor.
I am an eye, a mechanical eye. I, the machine, show you a world the way only I can see it. I free myself for today and forever from human immobility. I am in constant movement. I approach and pull away from objects. I creep under them. I move alongside a running horse's mouth. I fall and rise with the falling and rising bodies. This is I, the machine, maneuvering in the chaotic movements, recording one movement after another in the most complex combinations. Free from the boundaries of time and space, I coordinate any and all points of the universe wherever I want them to be. My way leads towards the creation of a fresh perception of the world. Thus I explain, in a new way, the world unknown to you.
So of course, this is another revolution, the revolution of the moving image camera. So we have the perspective and then we have the moving image camera, but it's still built in the camera is the perspective, the Renaissance perspective is there. As explained by Jean-Louis Baudry, fabricated on the model of the camera obscura, the motion picture camera permits the construction of an image analogous to the perspective projection developed during the Italian Renaissance. The resulting ideological effect is still defined in relation to the ideology inherent in perspective, clearly taken from an average drawn from Western easel painting. So although we may have Ozu, Japanese filmmaker, and Jean-Luc Godard, they use probably exactly the same camera at the same time, but with the same apparatus they're trying to express different forms of culture. Obviously more difficult for Ozu, but then we know, we've discussed that with colleagues and some of my PhD students here, that we could not invent a camera which would see the world in oblique way. It would be very difficult. We could, of course, we could create animation cartoon with oblique drawings, of course. So that's no problem to do that. That's what Ozu. Now, it's possible, and there are some filmmakers who manage to show this layering, and a very good example is a Taiwanese-Chinese filmmaker called Hao Sen. This is the beginning of one of the sessions of 3 times, and we can see here that he's actually playing with this idea of screens by opening this pool hole. So we have clearly this sense, and that's what typical of what Hao-Sen does, is that the camera always stays in the same position. There's a slight pan here, but you can see there's a depth of field. We can see the outside of the people passing by. Now I've nearly finished. The interesting point made by, and that will now arrive to the conclusion of what I really want to say. But Inoko again, he says, what if a lens or item that could visualize the world based on the principles of Japanese spatial recognition were invented? He said you couldn't. It were used for TV, video, and photograph. What if a visual approach different from Western spatial recognition took root and became the norm? There would be no need for any special philosophical teaching about man is but one part of the earth. If all mankind were looking at the world in that spatial manner, before long the boundaries between man and the environment would stop making sense, and we might create a new kind of society and culture. Okay, this is a bit hyperbolic, he says. But my conclusion is this. The ways of representing the world are not innocent. Perspectives unwittingly became the instrument of cultural colonization of the East. According to Philippe Descola, from the Renaissance onwards, there's a gradual separation of culture. And in the naturalist tradition, the Western tradition, there's a separation between human, non-human, and nature, which has been had terrible consequences on the earth. An anthropocentric vision, the Renaissance perspective and its representation of the world, announced a new era, that of the Anthropocene. Pushing the argument very far. And my way of trying to understand the cultural differences still through cinema, despite the difficulty of the Renaissance perspective being built in the apparatus, is in this project. It's a very large project, 2.5 years, which will finish in the spring next year. A cinematic musée imaginaire of spatial cultural differences, where we're trying to understand the cultural difference between Europe, the US, and China and Japan, concentrating on the home and the life, the everyday life. And we have now arrived at a first volume of the catalogue raisonné of everyday life activities. We have 100 films that we are studying, and then we're looking by different activities, and each of us are different films. So it's a new compendium of human activities studied for cinema. I have a copy here if you want to have a look. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.